There are moments when silence is louder than any answer you could receive. You expected something, guidance, reassurance, a sign, a door opening or closing. Instead, nothing happened. No signal, no response, no interruption. And that confused you because you've been taught that silence means absence, that if nothing responds, nothing is listening. That assumption is wrong. Silence is not neglect. Silence is evaluation. When nothing spoke back to you, it wasn't because you were ignored. It was because what you didn't require correction. You didn't share a voice. You didn't feel resistance. And that meant everything. One, silence is not rejection. You were waiting for approval or denial, and neither came. That's the moment most people unravel. They start scanning their memory for mistakes. They reread conversations in their head. They question whether they misunderstood the situation or misjudged themselves. Silence feels uncomfortable because it removes feedback, and most people depend on feedback to feel secure. But that dependence is the problem. Rejection is loud. Interference is loud. But correction announces itself clearly. When something is wrong, it rarely stays quiet. Resistance shows up. Delays pile up. Confusion increases. Emotional pressure builds. Something pushes back hard enough that you're forced to stop or rethink. Silence is different. Silence happens when there is nothing to stop. When no force intervenes, it's not because nothing is happening. It's because what is happening doesn't violate anything essential. The direction you're moving in isn't destructive. The decision you made isn't reckless. The timing isn't premature enough to require interruption. You weren't set blocked. You weren't set redirected. You weren't set warned. You were allowed. That's difficult to accept, because allowance feels underwhelming. People expect permission to come with a feeling, a signal, a rush of confidence, or some dramatic sense of certainty. But real permission is subtle. It doesn't inflate you. It doesn't excite you. It simply removes obstacles and lets momentum continue. And that quietness can feel unsettling if you're used to resistance. Silence doesn't flatter the ego. It doesn't congratulate you. It doesn't reassure you every step of the way. It just lets you move forward without interference. That's why people misinterpret it. They think, if this were right, I'd feel something stronger. But strength isn't always loud. Stability isn't always emotional. Think about how often you've been stopped before, how often something collapsed, delayed, or became complicated the moment you were heading in the wrong direction. Contrast that with this moment. Things didn't fall apart. Nothing forced you to retreat. There was no sudden confusion, no emotional chaos, no external resistance demanding your attention. That absence is not accidental. Silence doesn't mean you stay lost. It means you're aligned enough not to be restrained. It means the path you're on doesn't require supervision anymore. It means you're operating within boundaries that don't need enforcement. And that's a higher level of trust than constant feedback ever could be. The mistake is assuming that guidance always comes as noise. Sometimes guidance is the lack of it. Sometimes the clearest message is that nothing needed to be said. And that's exactly what happened here. 2. You expected praise, but you earned trust. You were waiting for acknowledgement. Not applause in a dramatic sense, but some kind of signal that said, yes, this was right. Most people need that. They rely on confirmation to settle their nervous system. Without it, doubt creeps in. So when nothing came, it felt strange, almost unfair. You did the work. You showed restraint. You moved carefully, and still, nothing responded. Here's the truth. Most people never learn. Praise is given to those who still need encouragement. Trust is given to those who don't stick. When someone doubts themselves, reassurance is necessary. When someone is unstable, they need to be checked on. When someone is reckless, they need supervision. Feedback exists to compensate for weakness, uncertainty, or inexperience. You didn't receive praise because praise would have been unnecessary. What you demonstrated didn't require motivation. It showed consistency. It showed self-control. It showed that you weren't acting for validation. And when someone operates at that level, constant acknowledgement becomes a distraction, not a reward. Silence, in this case, meant confidence in your ability to continue without being propped up emotionally. That's a hard pill to swallow, because most people associate being noticed with being valued. They think if no one reacts, then nothing mattered. But that logic is flawed. Some actions are so solid, they don't need commentary. They stand on their own. Think about how trust works in real life. The more someone proves they can handle responsibility, the less they're monitored. No one checks in constantly. No one hovers. No one praises every small decision. They are simply left to operate. That SEPs not neglect. That SEPs respect. You weren't congratulated because you weren't being evaluated anymore. You had already demonstrated enough discipline to be left alone. And being left alone is not abandonment. It's acknowledgement of competence. You expected affirmation because you're used to effort being rewarded emotionally. But this stage isn't about emotional reward. It's about reliability. It's about whether you can remain steady without external reinforcement. And you did. That's why nothing was said. Not because what you did went unnoticed, but because it didn't raise concern. It didn't require correction. It didn't need reinforcement. Silence was the signal that you could be trusted to continue without being carried. And that's a higher level of recognition than praise ever was. 3. Nothing stopped you because you passed the test. Most people think tests look dramatic. They expect pressure, conflict, temptation, or an obvious choice between right and wrong. But the most revealing tests don't look like tests at all. They look like normal moments where no one is watching and nothing forces your hand. This was one of those moments. There was no urgency, no threat, no reward dangling in front of you. You weren't cornered into a decision. You weren't pushed emotionally. You weren't scared into compliance. You had space. And in that space, you chose how to act. That SEPs what made it a test. Anyone can behave well when consequences are allowed. Anyone can make the right choice when pressure is obvious. But when there is no external force, no fear of loss, and no promise of recognition, behavior reveals who you actually are. You didn't need to be stopped because you didn't overreach. You didn't need to be warned because you didn't cross a line. You didn't need resistance because you showed restraint on your own. If what you were doing was misaligned, something would have intervened. Delays would have appeared. Confusion would have increased. Emotional instability would have crept in. That's how correction usually shows up. But none of that happened. Instead, things stayed quiet, stable, uncomplicated. That quiet wasn't emptiness. It was confirmation that nothing needed to be fixed. You passed the test precisely because you didn't know you were being tested. You acted without an audience. You made adjustments without being told. You held back where others would have pushed forward. That sets the level where oversight disappears. When someone has proven they can regulate themselves, external regulation becomes unnecessary. The absence of interference wasn't luck. It was the result of demonstrated control. You moved forward, and nothing stopped you. Not because there were no rules, but because you were already respecting them. And that's why the silence continued. 4. You didn't set need aside because you became one. At the beginning of any journey, people rely heavily on signals. They look for reassurance before they move. They wait for permission before they decide. They scan the environment for confirmation that they're not making a mistake. That's normal when clarity is still developing. But there comes a point where that habit becomes a weakness. If you always need a sign, it means you don't trust your own awareness yet. It means you believe guidance exists outside of you, instead of recognizing that it has already been built into how you think, feel, and respond. This moment was different. You weren't confused. You weren't frantic. You weren't acting out of impulse or fear. You didn't need something dramatic to convince you to move or to stop. You already knew what to do, and more importantly, you knew why you were doing it. That's why no sign appeared. Signs are given when direction is unclear. Warnings appear when someone is about to cross a boundary they don't recognize. Confirmation shows up when doubt is strong enough to cause paralysis. None of that applied here. You had awareness. Your behavior showed that you are already aligned with what mattered. You weren't waiting to be pushed. You weren't reacting emotionally to uncertainty. You were responding from a place of internal stability. That stability is what replaces external signals. In other words, the guidance didn't disappear. It relocated. Instead of something appearing in front of you, it showed up as restraint when it was needed, patience when delay made sense, and decisiveness when hesitation would have been avoidance. You didn't have to be told to slow down. You didn't have to be told to stop. You adjusted naturally. That's not coincidence. That's integration. When guidance becomes internal, signs become redundant. They would only repeat what you already understand, and repetition at this stage would have been insulting, not helpful. You didn't miss a sign. You outgrew the need for one. You became the point of reference. Your actions reflected clarity without theatrics. Your decisions carried weight without noise, and because of that, nothing needed to flash, interrupt, or announce itself. Silence wasn't absence. It was confirmation that you had reached a level where direction no longer needed to be external. You didn't need a sign because you had become one. 5. Nothing interrupted you because you were already correcting yourself. Interruption exists for people who ignore internal signals. Warnings appear when someone keeps pushing past discomfort. Resistance shows up when damage is about to happen, and the person refuses to notice it on their own. You didn't need any of that. Before anything could escalate, you paused. When something felt off, you didn't rationalize it away. You didn't force momentum just to prove a point. You noticed subtle discomfort early and adjusted before it turned into a problem. That ability matters more than people realize. Most people only stop when they're forced to. They wait until something breaks, someone leaves, or consequences become unavoidable. They confuse endurance with wisdom and call it strength. But real strength is the ability to regulate yourself before collapse makes regulation mandatory. You showed that. You slowed down without being punished. You recalibrated without being embarrassed. You corrected course without needing an external shock. Because of that, nothing had to step in. Interruption is a last resort, not a reward. It's what happens when self-awareness fails. When someone proves they can monitor their own behavior, external monitoring becomes unnecessary. Silence in this case wasn't passivity. It was efficiency. You were already doing the work that interruption is designed to force. You were questioning your motives, refining your approach, and staying within boundaries without being threatened or pressured. That made interference redundant. That's why nothing disrupted your path. Not because the path was easy, not because risk didn't exist, but because you were handling risk responsibly. When self-correction is present, correction from the outside becomes unnecessary. The system doesn't waste energy stopping someone who is already stopping themselves. And that quiet continuation you experienced wasn't random. It was the result of discipline functioning properly. Nothing interrupted you because there was nothing left to interrupt. 6. The absence of drama was the message. You were expecting intensity, some kind of emotional spike that would justify how heavy the journey has been. A breakthrough moment that felt loud enough to signal, This mattered. This was significant. Instead, what came next felt almost ordinary. No chaos, no rush, no emotional explosion. And that can feel disappointing if you've been conditioned to believe that importance must arrive with force. People often mistake intensity for meaning. They think if something truly matters, it should feel overwhelming, dramatic, or euphoric. That belief is false. Drama usually appears when something is unstable. It's a sign of friction, not progress. When a structure is weak, pressure creates noise. When something is misaligned, movement creates resistance. That's when emotions spike and situations escalate. What you experienced was the opposite. Things settled. They didn't explode. They didn't demand attention. They integrated smoothly into your life. That smoothness wasn't emptiness. It was evidence that nothing was breaking. Real growth is quiet because it doesn't fight reality. It fits into it. The absence of drama meant you weren't forcing change. You weren't chasing an outcome. You weren't trying to prove anything. You were allowing progress to happen at a pace your system could sustain. And sustainability is the real marker of transformation. When something truly changes, it doesn't need to announce itself. It becomes normal. It becomes part of how you operate. The excitement fades, not because it failed, but because it succeeded. That's why this stage didn't feel cinematic. You weren't set being tested through chaos. You weren't set being refined through pain. You were stabilizing, and stabilization is subtle. The lack of emotional noise wasn't anticlimactic. It was confirmation that what you were building didn't rely on adrenaline or urgency to survive. It could stand on its own without drama, propping it up. That calm you felt wasn't nothing. It was the message. 7. Silence meant it was time to own your path. There is a point where guidance steps back. Not because it has disappeared, but because responsibility has been transferred. Up until now, there were signals, nudges, pressure, and correction. You were being shaped, adjusted, and prepared. Then it stopped. That moment feels unsettling because silence removes the safety net. When nothing tells you what to do next, you can no longer blame confusion, timing, or lack of clarity. Choice becomes unavoidable. This was that moment. No voice stepped in. No force redirected you. No external authority took control. That wasn't abandonment. It was a handoff. Ownership begins when excuses run out. Silence doesn't comfort you, and it doesn't guide you step by step. It simply places the weight back where it belongs, on you. And that weight is heavy, because it means your decisions now matter without cushioning. You can't hide behind signs or delays anymore. You act, and the consequences are yours to carry. That's why this stage feels lonely to many people. They confuse solitude with isolation. But solitude is where autonomy is built. It's where you stop asking for permission and start acting from responsibility. You were no longer being led. You were being trusted to lead yourself. Silence marked a transition from dependency to authorship, from being guided to being accountable, from following a path to owning one. And you didn't collapse under that weight. You moved forward without panic. You made decisions without rushing. You accepted uncertainty without freezing. That's how you know you were ready for this stage. The silence didn't mean support was gone. It meant the training phase was over. What came next was no longer about instruction. It was about execution. You thought silence meant something was missing, that you had been overlooked, that you were waiting for a response that never came. But silence was the response. Nothing interrupted you because nothing needed to. Nothing warned you because you were already aware. Nothing spoke because your actions were already speaking clearly. This wasn't abandonment. It was confirmation. Silence showed you that you were no longer being corrected, no longer being supervised, no longer being held back for your own protection. You were trusted, and trust is quiet. Now the path is yours to walk without waiting for permission, without demanding reassurance, without needing a voice to move forward. Nothing was said because nothing needed to be said, and that meant everything.